So my book club is here. My yoga class is here. My friends from ABC News. Yay, okay, who's here? From NBC News. My college roommate. My sweetie pie. Yeah, he's like, really, seriously? This is like exactly where I wanted to be, and thank you, Ryan Williams, for making this happen. We used to work together, too. Now, let's see, am I on? See if yay, okay. So Tracy and I are going to have a conversation, but I just wanted to set the tone with some images of A'Lelia Walker and Madam Walker. My grandfather and my grandmother saved all of these things. I'm really lucky to have them, and I hope it will put you in the mood when you see what the Joy Goddess looks like. So I'm really going to speed through this and just do some captions. But Madam Walker and A'Lelia Walker, everybody who's here already knows me and knows something about Madam Walker's story. But when I was writing On Her Own Ground, The Life and Times of Madam C.J. Walker, I was developing the relationship between A'Lelia Walker and Madam Walker, and I realized that A'Lelia Walker needed her own book. She'd been kind of caricatured by people. The Netflix series didn't help because it was exactly the opposite of who she was. But I really wanted to tell her story, how she was a patron of the arts. But there would be no A'Lelia Walker without her mother, Madam C.J. Walker, the great entrepreneur. And this is how Madam Walker started. She developed a hair care product. She had really bad scalp infections because most Americans didn't have indoor plumbing or electricity. People didn't wash their hair very often. You don't want to really think about that too much. But as a result, she was going bald, as were thousands of other women. So she developed her product, her Madam C.J. Walker hair grower and vegetable shampoo. And that before and after picture shows that the product really did work. And that she was a master at advertising and marketing, and that's why she outpaced her competitors, because she knew how to appeal to other women and how to show her images. As with most parents, her motivation was making her daughter's life better. So they were very, hey, David, David Ferriero, former archivist of the United States. You're looking very tan. Anyway, so as with most parents, it was to make her daughter's life better. And they were in Louisiana. Madam Walker was a washerwoman until she was 38. Her daughter, she had been orphaned. Her husband had died, and A'Lelia Walker was an orphan at 3. So they were just struggling. And finally, Madam Walker decided that with the help of women of the church, that she was going to do something to make her life better. And she worked a little while for Annie Malone, selling her hair care products. Her brothers were barbers. She learned something about hair care. And then she developed her own product and married a man named C.J. Walker, hence Madam C.J. Walker. But this was, you can see the big change from the before and after picture. So by now, she's now 1910 in Indianapolis with her company, in her electric car, and with her daughter in their chauffeured car. So they're moving on up. And just, quickly, A'Lelia Walker persuades her mother, the company is based in Indianapolis. A'Lelia Walker persuades her mother that they need to be in Harlem, just as Harlem is becoming the cultural and political mecca of Black America. And so this is A'Lelia around 1913. And you can see she had presence and charisma and flamboyance. When she moved to Harlem, she bought a townhouse, and she bought the one next door, and they had it redesigned by Vertner Tandy, who was one of the first licensed Black architects in New York City. So it's as elegant as anything. It's now, if you know New York, it's where the Count Cullen Library is now, behind the Schomburg. It would never have been torn down in 2025, but it was torn down in the 40s to build the library. This is the beauty salon inside, as lovely as anything in New York City. The beauty school downstairs in the basement, and their living quarters were upstairs. One of the advertisements, the Walkers advertised extensively. Some of the Black newspaper publishers and editors said they helped keep them in business because they paid their bills on time. This is another, they had an international trade in Central America, and the Caribbean. And this is my grandmother May. You see, my grandmother May has very long braids, and A'Lelia Walker was married 3 times, but had no children, no biological children, and my grandmother was adopted. They had known my grandmother's uncle when they lived in St. Louis, when they were still very poor, at St. Paul AME Church. And when Madam Walker moved to Indianapolis, coincidentally, her grandmother lived across the alley from Madam Walker. And my grandmother's father had died. Her mother was a widow, the 3rd generation of women in her family to be widowed in her 30s with 8 children. And May had long hair, and Madam Walker's main product was Madam Walker's wonderful hair grower. So May became a model, and they developed an affinity for each other. A'Lelia Walker had recently been divorced, and Madam Walker thought she needed some responsibility. So it's a very interesting kind of Cinderella story, as you will see when you read the book, that's not always with a happy ending. But May, as promised, went to Spelman, was educated, became an executive at the company. But it's a complicated story. This is another A'Lelia Walker. I just want to show you her style. You know, I think there's some extra slides in here that I didn't remember. So A'Lelia Walker had moved to New York in 1913. Madam Walker's health was starting to fail, and A'Lelia persuaded her that she needed to move her personal residence to New York. So the company remained headquartered in Indianapolis. Madam Walker moved to New York into the townhouse, but the house was not big enough for 2 women. And so she hired the same architect to build this mansion in Irvington, New York, which still stands, and it's named Villa Lawaro because A'Lelia Walker was friends with Enrico Caruso, the opera tenor, and he came to visit the house when it was being constructed. It reminded him of homes in Italy, and he suggested the name Villa Lawaro using Lelia Walker Robinson, the name of her first husband, so Lewaro. Just another view. The music room, both women loved music, even when they were poor. Madam Walker, as Sarah Breed loved the washerwoman, had a good enough voice to be in the choir at St. Paul AME Church. The choir director was an organist, and they had a state-of-the-art Kilgan organ in this black church in St. Louis. He also was a trained tenor, opera tenor, and the principal of Lelia's school. For a while, they lived across the alley from Tom Turpin's Rosebud Cafe, where Scott Joplin played, and so they were surrounded by German music department leads who taught them German lieder. They were listening to ragtime. So they were exposed to a lot of music. So when they became wealthy, a lot of their friends were musicians, and they often had them entertaining live music in their homes. So they had harps and pianos and victrolas in their homes, always about music. I'm just showing this because they both have on fur coats, and I just, they both loved fashion. But they were both very generous. Madam Walker, of course, was a philanthropist, and A'Lelia Walker tried to carve out her own philanthropy after her mother died, and this is the crypt in Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx. Oh yeah, this is a lot more pictures. I think I'm gonna just speed through the rest of these. These are the 2 husbands you will read about in the book. After Madam Walker's death, A'Lelia Walker became president of the company. Many of you know Stanley Nelson and Jill Nelson. That's their grandfather on the left. He really kept things going, crossed the T's and dotted the I's. A'Lelia Walker went to Egypt in 1922. It was part of an Eat, Pray, Love expedition after her separation from her second husband, the evil Wiley Wilson. All right, so that's enough. And then Tracy and I are going to talk, but I just wanted you to get a feel for what she looked like. Thank you. Hey. Thanks for that.
Thank you.
Okay. Are we on? Yes. Excellent. Hey,
Yes, okay. All right, so good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here. I have been captivated by the Harlem Renaissance from the moment I discovered that my literary muse, Zora Neale Hurston, blossomed during this magnificent era. I am particularly inspired by the women of the era whose brilliance made the period shake, shimmer, and shine as they moved down Harlem streets and beyond. So to be in conversation with A'Lelia about A'Lelia is really a full circle moment for me, and I'm deeply honored that I'm able to do this because
Thank you.
I love everything about the Harlem Renaissance. So back in October, I had reached out to A'Lelia, and I said, we ran into each other at the March On Festival, then we ran into each other at the Hurston Wright Awards, and I was actually reaching out to her to do an interview for Unerased Black Women Speak, a platform that I work with. Yes, I see you over there, Gwen McKinney. And I said, A'Lelia, this is 3 encounters. This must be some plan by the universe. And sure enough, the plan was that I was going to be here tonight. I mean, it's not stalking, it's called manifestation. But at any rate, this book really reclaims a woman who lit up the world for so many artists, visionaries, and cultural icons. And so tonight we're going to dive into the legacy of her life, her key relationships, and how she became the center of one of the most fascinating times in Black history and global history. You spoke a little bit about your reasoning for starting this research, that there has been so many misconceptions over 100 years. It's just gotten worse and worse. And like you said, the depiction of her in Self-Made did not help. But could you tell me what literally sparked you to say, yes, it's time to write this book. It's time to embark on a 20-year journey. I know you didn't think it was going to take 20 years, but
Exactly, then you never start. But.
Right. But go ahead and tell me.
It's actually probably a 70-year journey, really, to tell you the truth, because even before I knew Madam Walker's name or A'Lelia Walker's name, I started discovering things that had belonged to them. And when my mother and I would visit my grandfather in his apartment in Indianapolis, and that had been, my grandmother had lived there, but she had died in 1945 when my mother was a freshman at Howard. But the bedroom, my grandmother's bedroom, apparently had not been touched. I mean, by the time I was visiting in 1955, when I was 3 years old, and as my mother and grandfather talked in the living room, I would sneak into this room and open the dresser drawers, and inside those dresser drawers were that was my first encounter with an archive, in a sense. Exactly. So there was mother of pearl opera glasses and ostrich feather fans. But the thing that fascinated me as a little kid the most were these miniature mummy charms. You open them up, and this little enameled mummy was inside. And I later learned that A'Lelia Walker had bought these in Cairo in 1922. I even have the bill of sale for that, because they saved everything. As Fred knows, I have too much stuff in the house. But those are the things that allowed me to tell the story. So I was fascinated by her. Then in high school, I wrote a report during my senior year about A'Lelia Walker and the Harlem Renaissance. Madam Walker was way too complicated for me at that point. But we had books, signed books by Langston Hughes and Countee Cullen and Jean Toomer, and those were things that were just on the shelf in the house. My mother didn't make a big deal about it, but those were the things that sort of gave me entree into A'Lelia Walker's life. But Madam Walker was the more substantial historical figure, and so I needed to write about her first and understand her. But as I said, I knew A'Lelia Walker needed her own story.
And so, well, one of the misconception is that she was very frivolous. But could you talk about some of her strategies with regard to business and her philanthropy?
Sure. So, the easy story is to say Madam Walker made the money, A'Lelia Walker spent the money.
That's what I heard. That's what I heard.
In fact, somebody was interviewing me yesterday, and she said, well, what do you think when people say that A'Lelia Walker just squandered the fortune? Well, like the Depression came, that had a lot to do with it.
There's that.
But she did enjoy spending money. I mean, that is very true. And I think some of the misconceptions about her come from a Harlem Renaissance history that was written a few decades ago that kind of caricatured her and said, A'Lelia Walker spent the entire 20s playing bridge. So nobody is that pathetic, but and she did like bridge, and she liked a good game of poker. But she also was trying to find her own way to come out of her mother's shadow, and they shared in common this love of culture and music. And so her philanthropy became hosting events, hiring black musicians for her parties, hiring black designers to design her clothes and my grandmother's wedding clothes. Then opening the Dark Tower. And the Dark Tower was a floor of her house, of the townhouse that you saw in 1927, after some of the writers like Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston and Wally Thurman had started to win these awards and get their books published. She wanted to do something more. She'd always had books in the beauty salon. You know, we have the stamp of the Walker Beauty Salon, you know, library, but she wanted to do something more, and that was her way of supporting the young writers.
Speaking of the relationship, someone described it as fire and ice. So what was the tension between them that was throughout the relationship?
Right, so their secretary, Violet Reynolds, who had gone to work for the Walker Company in like 1916 when she was still a teenager, was my neighbor when I was growing up, and she was still working at the Walker Company. So she was like, you know, she's keeping the legacy alive. And when I interviewed her in the early 1980s, and you know, at one point I just said, well, what was their relationship like? And she said, fire and ice. And then she kind of paused, and then she said, fire and ice. They loved each other dearly, and they sometimes fought fiercely. And she read their letters. They were writing letters to Mr. Ransom, the attorney and general manager of the company. And so she was the first person to open the letters and read them. And so she knew when they had arguments that, you know, Madam Walker wanted to, you know, she was trying to nurture, but she was also trying to control. So it was that, you know, it's like you can run the New York office, but I have some ideas, you know, and so that was, it felt like interference, and then they argued over the second and third husband. So Wiley, so this is why if you've seen the self-made thing, you know this, like that is actually totally not what happened. The real conflict between mother and daughter was over A'Lelia Walker's two boyfriends, Wiley Wilson and James Arthur Kennedy. Both doctors, both handsome. One was a good guy.
It's a bad boy.
And one was a bad boy. And who did she like? There you go. And who did her mother like? So that was the conflict. And then it has the story has lots and lots of twists and turns. So that was part of the fire and ice.
Yes, but you know, sometimes the relationship that you have with your mother shows up in the relationship that you have with your daughter. And I think that if that was fire and ice, then her relationship with May seemed to be more ice. But I want you, if there's nuance that I'm missing, I'd like for you to tell me, because I was struck by how she really was not very sensitive to the fact that she was really in an abusive relationship with her husband. So we had the big wedding. Talk about the big wedding and talk about some of the tension between that relationship.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it is, you know, generations repeat themselves. And I think my mother was such a wonderful mother. I was like, she must have seen this and like, I am not repeating that. So I am really grateful for that. But you know, May was adopted. She was old. She was about 12 or 13 years old when she was adopted. So she already had her own ideas about what to do. But it felt like in the beginning, like, you know, my dreams have come true. I'm moving out of a house. I mean, her parents they were leaders in their community, but they were not people of means. And so it was not like she was a waif. She wasn't coming from nothing. But she was in this, you know, elaborate, you know, wonderful space and beautiful homes and all of this extravagance. And it felt in the beginning like this is great. And then she went to Spelman. So there were lots of advantages. She traveled with Madam Walker. There were lots of things that she was gaining. But A'Lelia Walker was very controlling. And I don't know, I will never know exactly why, but she made her marry a person who was quite a bit older, who was a doctor, who was from a family that was a very prominent black family. So I guess she's trying to do, you know, the Vanderbilt thing of, you know, two families together. But it was a disaster because he was a horrible human being. He was an alcoholic and abusive, and it was just not a good match. And May was really stuck in this relationship. She extricated herself eventually. but it was painful for me to read about it and to write about it, but I wanted to tell her story.
And that's what I appreciate about you, because you are talking about your family members, but you did have enough distance to tell some hard truths. So I was curious about that. Now,
Well, so I'll tell you this. So when I was in graduate school at Columbia in journalism, my advisor was Phyllis Garland, who was the only black woman on the faculty. So this is the fall of 1975. At that moment when doors were opening, those of us who experienced that era, the first black this and that, and now some people are trying to close those doors.
yes.
But when Phil and I met to talk about my master's paper, I gave her some cliched topics, as graduate students sometimes do, and she listened, and at the end of the conversation, she said, "Your name is A'Lelia. Do you have any connection to Madam Walker and A'Lelia Walker?" And so I wasn't really walking around talking about that.
Right,
you know, I was trying to be me. And I said, "Yeah, that's my family." And she said, "That's what you're going to write about." So literally, 50 years ago is when somebody else validated the story for me and said that I needed to tell the story. And so, that was the fall of '75. And I went back to Indianapolis, where I had grown up, for Christmas, and my mother was in the hospital. She had lung cancer, terminal, and she was terminal, though at 23 that didn't really resonate with me, what that really meant. And I had a conversation with her when she was in the hospital, and I said, "Mommy, Madam Walker's not perfect, and I'm starting to, find flaws, and what do I do about that?" And she said, "Tell the truth, baby. It's all right to tell the truth." And so that, along with my journalism training, I think has allowed me to try to do that.
Yes. So, right? Now let's talk about the party. The party in the salons.
Why she's the joy goddess.
Why she's a joy goddess. So what made her gathering so special, that she was actually able to bring people from one side of town, other side of town, white, black, very diverse guests? What was it that she provided that made that happen?
I think it starts really with her personality. I mean, she as one person said later, she didn't just walk into a room, she swept into a room. And another person said that she would call people and say, "Darling, I'm having a party tonight." And it wouldn't be the same without you. Absolutely not. So
Expect that call.
She knew she was dramatic, and she knew how to bring people together. But starting with that charismatic personality, but she also had the houses. There was really nobody else who had a mansion and a townhouse and a small apartment getaway. So she could bring people together. And she loved to entertain. She loved music. She knew that the elements for a party were, great people, a great combination, a curated audience, even though people always brought their +1, 2, and 3 to her parties because they wanted to be there. Good drink, and it was prohibition, but she had her own personal bootlegger. She was a great cook, as was her mother, and then she hired black caterers, and then she had the places that people wanted to see.
So, and Langston was the one who called her Joy Goddess, right? Yeah. So, but so what were her vulnerabilities? When the party, everybody's gone, the last guest is gone. What do you think were her biggest concerns?
Yeah, well, she knew that people compared her to her mother, and she could never live up to that. There was nobody. Madam Walker was an original. She had become a millionaire. She employed thousands of women. She had given other women economic independence, helped them buy homes for their families and educate their children. She was an internationally known figure. And A'Lelia Walker was her daughter. And that was always, and she was her daughter. So she could never be that person, and people were always going to compare her. So she kind of did I'm just not going to be that. I'm going to be my own person. And so she would be, what we call an influencer today. I mean, I think she saw that as her role, as keeping attention on the company, having these big extravaganzas like the big fancy wedding for my grandmother who didn't want to marry the person she was marrying. Or, she went after she came back from this trip to Paris, London, Nice, Monte Carlo, Rome, Addis Ababa, where she met the Empress, and Cairo, and Alexandria, and London. she came back and she did a tour, what she called a Holy Land tour, and so it was to sort of drum up interest from their agents. And she talked about her Holy Land trip because she knew church and the Bible were central to the lives of many of their agents. So she knew how to do that kind of thing. But her vulnerabilities were that she was always felt inadequate, that she was never going to be like her mother. And then she had health problems, and she had a stroke in 1924. She fully recovered from it. But after that, I think she was just kind of even less willing to, play the game.
That's right. She reinvented herself a few times, too. Well, first of all, when she first came out of poverty, changed her name. What was the story about her changing her?
Right. So she was born Lelia McWilliams. Her father's name was McWilliams, and she started calling herself Lelia Walker after her mother became Madam C.J. Walker. And she wasn't adopted by her stepfather, Charles Joseph Walker, but she wanted to make sure that people were clear on her affiliation. I mean, she was running this. There was Lelia College, their beauty school, and she was running the New York office. So that's what she was known as. But after she came back from this overseas trip, she added the A' to her name. Now, this is the mystery that frustrates me so that I don't know exactly why. Because the two people that I knew growing up and that I interviewed who would have known her before and after the A' both said, oh, that was always her name. But I know it wasn't because I have the documents. There are a couple of things that I would, if I were writing a novel, that I would say. That she was going through a divorce. She was just really trying to reinvent herself. Maybe a numerologist while she was overseas said if you just had 2 more characters, things would be better. And the other part is there was another Black woman who was sort of generally in her circle who lived in Nashville, but they were sort of in the same circle, whose name was also Lelia Walker. So maybe
that's it right there.
There it is. See, but I'm exploring the possibilities.
Okay, so my author friend Bernice McFadden, she's coined a phrase called ancestor. And you've taken such care in preserving the history of your ancestors. Were there any moments where you felt guided by them, to find a surprise? I know you're a journalist, but did you have any spiritual?
Oh, all the time. Oh, all the time. Like when I would be ready to give up, or when I think there was a moment, it was a while ago, I was really judging Lelia Walker and some of her decisions. And it was like, really? Seriously, you're judging me? Yeah, seriously. But there were also other, just serendipity of people that I would meet, or many of the people who were the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of some of the people I write about, who I would run into, here are 2 examples that are, the ancestors must have been helping me. So Lelia Walker's second husband, Wiley Wilson, had a brother named Ed Wilson. Ed and his brother John had grown up in Pine Bluff, Arkansas, which is where my grandfather's family was from. My grandfather met my grandmother because somebody knew that he was a young lawyer taking a finance course at Columbia, and this recent divorce, they should meet my grandfather. Okay. But these brothers, John and Ed Wilson, had been students of my grandfather's father when they were in high school. My grandfather's father went to Lincoln University in the 1880s and was valedictorian of his class. And he persuaded these 2 Wilson brothers to go to Lincoln. So they graduated from Lincoln. Wiley was their younger brother. So I had written a blog post several years ago about Ed and Wiley and John Wilson, and I got a call out of the blue from someone who said, so I'm Ed Wilson's son. And I'm like, oh, well, that's really interesting. And then it was a longer story than I can tell now. And then I said, well, whatever happened to, so Wiley had an affair and married Inez Richardson, and they had a daughter named Joyce. And I said, so I'm talking to him, and I said, whatever happened to Joyce? She's dead, yes? He said, oh, no. Joyce lives in Reno. So Joyce and I developed this email conversation. Okay. She was in her 90s. She had a great memory, and she told me all of these stories. Her mother and Wiley divorced pretty soon. But it was like that just came out of the blue. Right. Then the other story of just like the ancestors want you to tell the story. we would go to the apartment to visit my grandfather, and all of these things were in the apartment, and he had this trunk full of things. But when he moved back to Arkansas, where he had grown up, he put a bunch of things in storage in Indianapolis at Stewart's Moving and Storage, but he didn't pay the bill. So, which happens a lot. And so I thought, I am so lucky to have the things I have, but there's some things I'm never going to have because they've probably been thrown out or, sold or whatever. But fortunately, the Stewart family, with their family friends, and my brother and the nephew of the founder were very good friends. And as Tony Stewart was starting to downsize and clean out the storage area, he started finding these things that had been in the back of the warehouse for a long time. So for a while, every month or so, he would send me a box of things. Wonderful. And in that box was the autographed copy of the Weary Blues to A'Lelia, which I knew existed because Wally Thurman and Langston had written each other about him signing this book. Right. So that book. And then her travel diary from this trip overseas. No. So all of those things, it's like they want to be found. The ancestors want to be heard.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Right. So, of course, I'm totally in awe about your meticulous research. The notes are a Harlem Renaissance Bible, and your acknowledgments was like, I think, 20 pages in and of itself.
I had a lot of people to thank.
So, as someone who's doing research now on a portion of Zora Neale Hurston's life, please share the essential ingredients that brought this book to life. Like, what were the ingredients that got us here right now?
Mm-hmm. So, very fortunate that Mr. Ransom and Violet Reynolds, who told me about Fire and Ice, the secretary, were really keepers of the flame and saved all of the letters and business records and ledgers and legal documents. So I had those things. We donated them to the Indiana Historical Society, and they've now been digitized. But that was kind of the foundation for, much of my original research. And then I was fortunate in the summer of '82 to interview 8 or 10 of A'Lelia Walker's friends, the Harlem Renaissance survivors who were still around, including Jerry Major, who later became the society columnist for Jet. But during the Harlem Renaissance, she and Bessie Bearden, Romery Bearden's mother, were the society columnists, so Lilia's best friends. And so they wrote about what she was doing every week. So I had that set of material. And then just the newspapers. And initially, if I wanted to read the Chicago Defender, I would have to go to Chicago to go to the library and read microfilm. Well, now it's on newspapers.com and ProQuest. So I have all of that material. And Ancestry.com has been really helpful. I have created a family tree for many of the characters in the book. I did a little commercial with Ancestry.com a few years ago. And I said, I think I have a lot of family trees. And they said, oh, yeah, you are a super user. They're like 300 plus. Right. But it helps me organize things. And being organized, even though there's a lot of clutter and a lot of stuff that's not organized, the basic foundation of my research is organization. And I'll tell you one other thing. Years and years ago, Alex Haley wanted to do a book about sort of a mini-series and a fictionalized work on Madam Walker. And I did the research for that project, which never came to pass. But it was like he was put into my path to help me. And he said to me, and Alex had a deep voice, and he said, baby, make a file for every year of your character's life, and then just drop things into that file. Well, so I still have all those files. And this is pre-computers. But that helped me organize things. And then I had probably 1,000 people. And I have a folder for them. So when I wanted to find something, I would go to that folder.
Love it. And people that read along the way, helped along the way.
Right.
So yes, you were set. You just need to take your time.
Right. Yeah, and so many, as you know when you write, the writing part is so solitary and so isolating. But the research is with people that your kindred spirits, and that is really what helps. And all of you all who cheered me on when it looked like I was never going to finish.
And we're so grateful that you did, because this is an outstanding book. I love it so much. Thank you so much for this beautiful conversation.
So questions?
That went so fast, but now you're going to be able to purchase the book. I guess it's right outside.
Right, but we're going to take a couple of
Oh,
questions.
we're going to take some questions
Yes.
first. Okay, my bad. I'm rushing it. Y'all have questions too?
There are a lot of people here. I'm so
Thank you.
This makes me think like when I was in high school and you'd have a party. It's like, is anybody coming to my party? So thank you all.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for being. Oh, sorry. Oh, sorry. Oh, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Yeah, no, I don't, because we can't really see.
Thank you so much to both of you for being here today. My name is Nathan, and I'm a recent graduate of Montgomery College. I'm hoping ultimately to teach history. That's something I've been very passionate about for a long time. And you actually signed a bookplate for me for On Her Own Ground in around 2021, and that really meant a lot to me. And your work has been very impactful for me. My question is, I was reading about Alila Walker's relationship with Mary McLeod Bethune, and I read about Dr. Bethune's eulogy. And I was wondering, what would you say are some of the most interesting and important things that you found in your research about Alila Walker and Madam C.J. Walker's relationship with Dr. Bethune?
So Mary McLeod Bethune, and then, the Nualiwe Rooks' new book on Mary McLeod Bethune, others have written, but hers, it's a very lovely meditation. So Madam Walker and Mary McLeod Bethune met each other very early at a National Association of Colored Women's convention when they really were both starting out, and they were very supportive of each other and were inspired by each other. So that was an important relationship. Madam Walker gave money to what was then Daytona Normal and Industrial Institute and wrote two very touching letters when Madam Walker was ill in 1919, one to Madam Walker expressing her concern, and then another to Alelia Walker after Madam Walker died. And then fast forward, Alelia Walker was not involved in the women's organizations in the same way that her mother had been, but I think these women like Mary McLeod Bethune and Margaret Murray Washington and Ida B. Wells, kind of saw her as a daughter. They weren't in her life all the time, but they cared about her. So when Alelia Walker died, Mary McLeod Bethune did the eulogy at the funeral. I think if you have to go to the microphone because the
I got it.
because it's being taped. Oh, Ryan's got us covered. Okay.
First of all, thank you so much for this beautiful work and this conversation. My question is, as a writer, as you started this work and this journey, did you have some thoughts about what you were going to uncover? I mean, what shifts or surprises happened from the beginning to the end? Mm-hmm. If you can talk about that.
Sure. So when I wrote On Her Own Ground, Madam Walker dies in 1919, and so I had read carefully all of the letters up to that point. But then I had another 12 years of Alelia Walker's life, and I had these letters and hadn't read them. So I was really I had an open mind about what I was going to discover. And because she had been framed in some of the, most well-read Harlem Renaissance books, that she was, frivolous and not serious and wasn't really a patron of the arts. And, it was just really a framing that was really negative. And so as I read, I was like, this is not, these letters and these articles and these interviews that I did are really different from this caricature of her. And so as I immersed myself, I was so glad to discover the real person who was there, the complicated person who was there, the person who had a great sense of humor, but who also, as you say, had vulnerabilities. And, so I was open to what I was going to find.
Okay.
Hello. I wanted to know whether or not did Madam C.J. Walker know any of the famous people that we now know from the Harlem Renaissance? Was she associated with any of them?
With the famous people of the Harlem Renaissance?
Yes.
Oh, no, absolutely. So A'Lelia Walker's townhouse was at 100 on 136th Street, like 135th and Lenox, right around the corner, was ground zero, for the Harlem Renaissance, Lenox Avenue. And A'Lelia Walker knew everybody, and everybody knew them because they were these famous people. Madam Walker as a business person, as a political activist, as a person who supported the NAACP's anti-lynching movement. And they both loved culture. They both loved theater and music. They were friends with, whether it was Burt Williams or Langston, and A'Lelia later with Langston Hughes, James Weldon Johnson, W.E.B. Du Bois, Paul Robeson, any name that you can think of who was in Harlem during that period of time, they knew, and knew them. So yeah, absolutely, they were at the center of things. And I think that's why I feel confident in saying A'Lelia Walker was like the first black celebrity heiress. There were other black people who had wealth before then. I mean, sometimes this story, people think, oh, Madam Walker's like the first black millionaire. Well, there were many men who were millionaires before. There were other black women who were very successful. So they're not the first ones to have a lot of money. But she, I think, is the first one to sort of really be the flamboyant, has the means, spends the money, where others might have been more conservative and more subdued. But she is out there in the public eye.
Hi, I'm over here.
Oh.
I was just wondering, with the travel journals that you read, can you describe some of her experiences? Was she a solo traveler back then, and what was that experience being out in the world as a black woman like for her at that time?
She often traveled with other people, but for this trip, she went by herself. And I don't know that's how she planned initially to do it, but in November of 1921, she boarded the SS Paris, the ocean liner of the times, in first class. And one of probably the only black woman in first class. In fact, there was an American, one of the Vanderbilt descendants, who was on the ship and who talked to a French reporter and described her as a negress, and very negatively, and it was written about in a French paper. But she made friends with other Europeans who were on the ship. J.P. Morgan's daughter was on the ship. There was a French woman who she went to dinner, she invited her to dinner after she got to Paris. But what I learned specifically in the journal, I knew where she was because her third husband, Dr. James Arthur Kennedy, had written her these wonderful love letters while she was there. And so I had those letters. So I knew where she was, and from the newspaper articles, I could tell the trajectory of her trip. And I had a sense of where I thought she might be and who she probably would have been with. But when I got that diary, that travel diary, like 3 pages in, she says, on the first night I had dinner with Louis Mitchell and Antoinette Brooks Mitchell. Louis Mitchell was a famous jazz drummer who had moved to Europe in 1914. Antoinette Brooks Mitchell has a DC connection because her father was the minister at 19th Street Baptist. He was very upset that she married a musician, but they had a very happy marriage. But that centered it for me. And then she talks about them taking her on a tour throughout Paris, and she went to the club. He played at a very famous club, I don't know if it was the Paris, Cafe Paris or Paris Casino, but that was where a lot of the diplomats and international people hung out. And she made friends with people like Paul Poiret, who was a famous designer who she entertained when he came to New York. But that trip to Europe and Africa and the Middle East really opened up some doors for her and made her see that there was something other than the deep racism of the Woodrow Wilson era in the United States. And so now when people would come from Europe, they would call her up because a friend had told them to be in touch with her. So I think that sort of widened her circle of friends.
Hello, Mrs. Bundles.
Hello.
So you were just discussing past several questions about A'Lelia Walker traveling to Europe. That was around the time that you first started to have the first modern development of Pan-Africanism, where you had the Pan-African conferences in London and other places in Europe and also in the United States. Did any of that impact her thinking or her actions at that time?
You know, more her mother. Madam Walker had been really interested in going to Paris for the peace talks at Versailles, and she had applied for a passport, and like a number of African Americans, her passport was denied. In fact, she was spied upon by a black spy in the War Department who, much to my delight, called her a Negro subversive in the as David Ferriero knows, in the MID papers, there's reports where she and Ida B. Wells are Negro subversives. So I was like, the enemies, Nixon enemies list, yes, that's the sort of equivalent. But Madam Walker wanted to do that, and she also was very focused on what was happening with the German-controlled African nations. A'Lelia Walker wasn't involved in the politics on that level, but when Liberian President C.D.B. King came to the United States after World War I, hoping to recover the loan that he had been promised by the U.S. government, he was not invited to dinner at the White House, but he was entertained at Villa Lawaro for a July 4th extravaganza with a live orchestra and fireworks. So that, and he, in his letters, to her, he says it was one of the highlights of his trip. So she's aware of Africa, but not as engaged in the political aspect as her mother. Right here. Hi, Brenda.
Good evening.
A Spelman woman.
Thank you. Just celebrated my 50th reunion.
Congratulations.
I'm Brenda Seiler, a columnist with the Washington Informer newspaper. Black-owned, female-owned, and celebrating its 60th anniversary. And still free. I'm interested in, I'll let them know. You have amassed a treasure of information on so much. I'm trying to figure out, and maybe you can tell us, what will be next?
Rest.
How will the saga continue? What might be the next, for lack of a better term, product that will be produced? Can you give us some hints?
Yeah, no, so I'm not writing any more books. I mean, that's just like, seriously. And why do people say, oh, you're sure? No, and I'm not, because I don't want to sit in front of a computer for 10 more years. I mean, that's really what this took, and I have neglected friendships, I mean, I'm not trying to do that anymore. But what is next for me? I mean, I really do want to develop some other projects, whether it's musical or theater or, taking another stab at a series. But this time I'm already working with people who share my sensibilities. So that, that's something I want to do. But I mean, I want to read some of the books that are in my house. I want to clean up my house. I want to travel. There's so many places that I, have neglected going. So this is really, a decade of about like my bucket list, those kinds of things. Yeah, and rest, seriously. That's important. I started taking a Pilates class once I finished the book. I need, things like that. I'm already doing a yoga class. Though I haven't been in a while, you all forgive me.
A'Lelia, we have two final questions. One
right.
from the front row here to your left.
Thank you. David.
Having lived with this project for 13 years myself, I just want to congratulate you on the level of research that you did. It's just phenomenal.
Thank you.
And just to follow up on the previous question, you have learned so much and you have discovered so much. Every day, every conversation that we've had is some new piece of your history which you've recreated. And I can guarantee you, in this tour that you're doing, you're going to develop so much more information about about your family. What is next for you?
Well, and that's true. One of the fun things about this phase, because this is really only my second, event, is that I love the questions because I'm discovering what resonates with other people, things that I didn't know. I had one interview where someone said to me, this is so different from what I thought it would be. And I'm like, well, what did you think it would be? Because I want to know what you thought it would be. And she said, well, A'Lelia Walker, because she's been described as frivolous and a dilettante, she said, so much of what she did was with intention. She was very intentional, very strategic about what she did. And so now I'm curious what other people are discovering. So thank you.
And our last question.
Hello, my name is Dr. Adrian Seven Washington, and I got my doctorate through the National Beauty Cultures League, which was instituted under your family's legacy, per se. And you spoke at my graduation in 2019. And through your development research, what did you find out about her, Alelia's contribution to the National Beauty Cultures League? Because a lot of people don't know that you can get a doctorate in professional cosmetology,
Right.
but it's through your family's legacy that we're able to do that. And so what did you find in your research?
So thank you for this. So the National Beauty Culturist League was founded in 1919, and Madam Walker died in 1919, but she had planted the seeds for this national organization of cosmetologists. She had her convention in 1917. These women came from all over the United States, and it wasn't just about doing hair. It was about being leaders in the community. She told the women, your first duty is to humanity. I want others to look at us and realize that we care not just about ourselves, but about others. And at the end of the convention, the women sent a telegram to President Woodrow Wilson urging him to support legislation to make lynching a federal crime. So it was these women who had their own income. They didn't have to be maids and laundresses and cooks. They had a business. When they became very involved politically, and the National Beauty Culturist League, the leadership of that organization through the decades were very engaged, so that in the 1950s and 1960s, Martin Luther King always came to their conventions. Lucille Green Randolph, whose husband A. Philip Randolph organized the March on Washington, was a Walker-trained agent and was president of the Harlem Walker Beauty School Clubs. And this is Tiffany Gill's research in the book Beauty Shop Politics. In Tiffany's research, she found that many of the buses that went to the March on Washington were paid for by cosmetologists, by members of the National Beauty Culturist League. So there is a full circle. Mm-hmm.
Friends of the library, please give a hand to Tracy and Lily Bundles.
Thank you.